Chair now recognizes Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Mulligan, you wrote a book called The Redistribution Recession. And I think it was based on what the Obama administration did with their American Restoration Recovery Act. And in that, I think you pointed out that all of the predictions for all of the new rules and regulations that the Obama administration was imposing through that resulted in really in a reduction in employment. Is that correct, or am I off a little bit on that?
You're correct. Thank you for reading that.
I try to look for factual information and try not to make things political. My concern is, having grown up dirt poor myself, is how people misunderstand regulations and business taxes for that matter. And some of people in this room, I think that there's no real downside to regulatory costs, but the fact of the matter is, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, businesses don't pay taxes and they don't pay regulatory costs. Who pays that?
Consumers and workers, when they earn the money and when they go spend it.
So it's very inflationary, isn't it? And as I understand it, the first year of the Biden administration, they added over $200 billion in new regulatory costs, 3 times what the Obama administration did in the first year they were in office. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah, in my testimony, I point out that they're missing a lot of costs, so it's more like $600 billion.
Yeah, and they're on track to add even more before the end of this first term, which will further increase the burden on low-income families. I mean, we don't live in $2.5 million houses. You know, I lived in a house my dad built himself and shared a bedroom with my brother that had cardboard between the 2 floors. So when you start adding on those regulatory costs that get passed on to the consumer, whether it's in the form of groceries or household utility costs, it's an enormous burden on people. One of the things that concerns me about some of the regulations and policies of the Biden administration is what's happened in Europe. And just this past winter, when just a few weeks ago a report came out that indicated 68,000 Europeans died because they couldn't afford their household utility bills. These are people who had cardiovascular problems, respiratory problems. I'm concerned about that happening here in the United States as they continue the regulations that are impacting our power grid. Do you have any concerns about that?
Well, one of the things I did look at, and it was in Figure 3 in my testimony, was how low-income households are affected by the cost of some of these things. In particular, one of the categories in that chart is energy. And energy is a big part of the budget for low-income households, and it can be very tough on them if regulations or other things raise energy prices.
How about how it impacts business? One of the things that came out was a report from the Gallup research arm, and it said that prior to 2008 there were about 100,000 more business startups than there were closures, but by the end of 2014 there were 70,000 more business closures. When you get right down to the core numbers, there are about 6 or 7 million businesses, maybe somewhere in that range, that really provide employment for the United States. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, in that order of magnitude, yes.
Yeah. So when you overregulate business and you start losing businesses, we start to lose our really entrepreneurism here, because as I try to point out to people, when you overregulate the economy, you overtax the economy, money's just like water. It will always seek the path of least resistance, and that's, you start losing capital investment. Has that been your experience as an economist?
I mean, one of the issues with central planning or regulation is not very innovative. It's much easier as a regulator if things were like they were yesterday. And your small businesses, their entire intention is to make things different than they were yesterday. They have a new idea, a new thing.
But you also hear all the time about how low the unemployment rate is, but you never hear anyone talk about, at least on the other side of the aisle, about how low the labor participation rate is. And is that a function of regulations, or is that a function of policies that maybe pay people not to work?
Yeah, I think that some of the other tax and spending policies, what we do see from the regulation is very low real wages. Real wages has fallen, I think, a record 25 or 26 months in a row. Very low productivity of workers. Regulation is, as we predicted, regulation would lead to that.
And that is death by 1,000 cuts. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms.